You wouldn't really do that, she said, her voice fragile, almost a whisper of disbelief. I looked at her, rain dripping from the hood of her coat, and said, I just did. Brooke was sitting on the edge of the curb, one hand clutching her bag, the other pressed against her forehead. I had seen her in passing at the office, always polite, always careful not to stand out. But tonight, under the dim lights of the nearly empty parking lot, she looked different. Smaller, somehow more human than the composed figure I'd glimpsed in meetings. I held my umbrella over both of us, though I didn't hurry her. Silence stretched between us, the kind that isn't uncomfortable but deliberate, like an invitation to speak when ready. Finally, she let out a shaky laugh that barely reached her eyes. You didn't have to, she murmured. I did, I said simply. There was no bravado, no need for explanation. Some things, when necessary, don't require justification. I helped her to her feet, adjusting her bag on her shoulder. Her coat was damp, the fabric sticking lightly to her skin. She flinched away instinctively but didn't pull completely back. You're calm, she said, a hint of curiosity threading through her vulnerability. Most people would have. She trailed off. I didn't ask her to finish. Words were optional. I drove us to her apartment. The streets gleamed under the rain, reflecting the scattered streetlights like liquid gold. She stayed silent in the passenger seat, staring out at the city, her hands resting lightly on her knees. Occasionally, she would glance at me, perhaps measuring, perhaps unsure what to make of a man who didn't push, who simply showed up. At the door, she hesitated, key in hand. I didn't speak, just waited. She gave me a fleeting smile, one that hinted at both relief and something unspoken, something careful. Thank you, she said finally, her voice steadier than before. I nodded. You're welcome. There was no pressure to linger, no insistence to continue the conversation. We had arrived where she needed to be, and that was enough. But when she turned the key and glanced back at me, her eyes carried a quiet weight, a subtle acknowledgement that something had shifted, though neither of us named it. I left her, under the dim glow of her porch light, the rain continuing to fall softly around us. Driving away, I felt an unusual lightness. It wasn't heroism. It was simply the quiet certainty of being where I was supposed to be at the moment she needed it most. And somewhere in that small act, something had begun. The next morning, I saw her at the office kitchen, pouring coffee with a careful hand, stirring slowly as if measuring time instead of sugar. She didn't look up when I walked in, just kept her gaze on the swirling. I poured myself a cup and leaned against the counter, the aroma between us both grounding the silence. Did you sleep? I asked casually, not prying, just acknowledging her presence. She gave a small nod, her lips pressing together as though forming words she wasn't ready to speak. You didn't have to come last night, she said, stirring again. Her voice carried that same fragile uncertainty, the kind that had a quiet weight to it. I shrugged lightly. I wanted to, I said. The simplicity of the words seemed to startle her. She finally looked up, her eyes meeting mine, searching, maybe testing. I don't usually let people. She stopped mid-sentence. I didn't interrupt. She wasn't asking for permission or approval. She was naming a truth she carried quietly. We stood together, the hum of the office around us. But in that small space, it was just the two of us. I offered her my attention without pressing for anything more. It wasn't about being the hero or proving myself. It was just about being present. She tilted her head, and for a moment, the walls she kept around herself seemed thinner. Do you ever feel like you're expected to have everything figured out? She asked, voice low, almost private. I nodded, understanding more than I needed to explain. Some days, yes, most people pretend, but it's exhausting, I said, letting the words settle. She smiled faintly, a small relief in her expression. We didn't rush. Coffee sipped slowly, conversation meandering from trivial office matters to small personal detail. Each sentence, each pause, built a rhythm neither of us noticed at first. There was a subtle warmth in the quiet moments, a sense that presence alone could be reassuring. Later, she excused herself to her desk. I lingered by the coffee machine for a few more seconds, watching her from afar. The way she folded her hands over her cup, the way she glanced at her email before looking up, small gestures, but each carried a subtle honesty. By the end of the morning, something had shifted, not dramatically, not with fireworks or confessions, but in the way she moved, lighter, a little less guarded, and in the way I felt, quieter, more certain that being present without expectations sometimes meant more. We returned to our routines, but the brief connection in that shared silence left an imprint. I didn't need her to acknowledge it yet. Some things grow slowly, and I knew this was one of them. The unfolding wasn't rushed. The next time we met, it would feel different, just as tonight had already felt different from any other night before it. I noticed it first on a Tuesday afternoon, sitting on the corner of her desk, a small potted plant, leaves drooping as if it had been forgotten, I walked past her cubicle, pretending to check something on my phone, but my eyes stayed on it. She was typing, brow furrowed, completely absorbed in her work, unaware that her tiny plant had surrendered to neglect. Later, when she stepped away, I gently picked it up and carried it to the kitchenette. I rinsed the pot, trimmed a few leaves, and gave it fresh soil. It was a simple gesture, almost imperceptible, but it felt right. I returned it to her desk just as she came back, acting as if nothing had happened. She noticed immediately. Her eyes widened slightly. Did you just... She stopped, uncertain how to finish. I only smiled and shrugged. Thought it could use a little help, I said. She nodded slowly, a mix of surprise and something softer crossing her face. For the rest of the day, I watched small shifts in her demeanor. She glanced at the plant more often, adjusting it, touching the leaves lightly as if reconnecting with something fragile. I didn't comment. The quiet satisfaction of a simple act carried its own weight. That evening, I lingered near the exit, expecting nothing, yet curious about her response. She walked past me, her bag over one shoulder, and said without looking up, "Thanks for noticing." There was no emphasis, no drama, just acknowledgement, and it was enough to seed a fragile thread between us. Over the following days, I found myself looking for similar moments. A pen left on the floor, a chair pulled awkwardly under a desk. I did not intervene out of obligation. I intervened out of presence. Each act small, deliberate, without expectation. She noticed, subtly, in the way she paused to look around, in the way she smiled briefly when our eyes met. One late afternoon, she stayed at her desk long after most had left. I walked by, quietly placing a cup of water beside her plant. She looked up then, and for the first time, I saw her shoulders relax in my presence. A small exhale of no words were needed. By the end of the week, the plant was thriving. So was the rhythm between us. The office felt less like a maze of routines, and more like a quiet space we were shaping together, imperceptibly. We didn't discuss it, but the subtle language of attentiveness spoke volume. That night, walking to my car, I thought about how small gestures could anchor someone, how quiet consistency could matter more than grand declarations. And somewhere in that thought, I realized we were beginning something neither of us could fully name yet, something patient and deliberate, like water nourishing roots beneath the surface. Brooke called me unexpectedly that evening, voice tight but not frantic. "I need a hand with something, if you're free." I agreed without hesitation. She met me at her apartment, keys in one hand, a flat-pack furniture box in the other. She looked absurdly small carrying it, her coat a shade darker in the dim hallway light. I lifted the heavier side and we carried it inside, moving slowly around corners and obstacles, silently coordinating like we'd done this before. Assembling the piece took time. Screws, dowels, panels, all demanding precision and patience. We worked quietly, occasionally exchanging words to clarify measurements or instructions. I noticed how she frowned when something didn't fit, how her hands trembled slightly when she realized a screw was missing. I didn't rush her. I offered steady hands when needed, but mostly I was a constant presence, patient, observant. Once it was done, Brooke leaned back, arms crossed, breathing heavily. She looked at the furniture and then at me, eyebrows raised. "I guess we made a decent team," she said softly. I nodded, smiling faintly. We did. Her relief was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it lingered in the air like the scent of rain-soaked streets. She disappeared into her kitchen a few moments later, returning with 2 plates of leftovers from earlier. "Not much, but I thought we could eat," she said, avoiding eye contact. I took the plate she offered, and we ate slowly at her small table. Conversation minimal but genuine. She talked about her childhood, the quiet routines of her family, the pressure she often felt to always appear composed. I listened, asking simple questions when she paused, letting her speak without judgment or intrusion. The evening stretched on in that delicate balance. At one point, she laughed quietly at a trivial comment I made about misaligned screws, and I realized how rare it was to hear her laugh without reservation. It wasn't forced or performative. It was private, safe, as if she knew in that moment no one else's eyes were watching. Later, as I prepared to leave, she lingered near the doorway. "Thanks for tonight," she said softly. Her voice carried an unfamiliar weight, an acknowledgement beyond mere courtesy. I smiled, simply nodding. "Anytime," I said. No promises, no dramatics, just presence. Walking back to my car, I felt the quiet shift that had begun weeks ago deepen. The evening hadn't been extraordinary in any conventional sense. No confessions, no grand gestures. But it had changed something. A thread had been woven, subtle yet undeniable, connecting us in ways that neither of us could yet define but both could feel. I was about to turn off my phone when the screen lit up with a message from Brooke. It was simple, almost casual. but the timing made it feel deliberate. "Can I ask you something?" she typed. I hesitated for a fraction of a second, then responded, "Of course." Her reply came slowly. "Do you ever feel lonely, even when you're surrounded by people?" I read it twice, sensing the weight behind her words. I didn't rush to answer. There was no need to fill the silence with cliches or quick reassurances. Instead, I typed slowly, carefully, "Yes, sometimes. But it passes differently," replied almost immediately, and I could feel the small tremor in her fingers. Words. "I guess I just hate feeling like no one really notices." I understood that quiet ache, the fear of invisibility. I wrote back simply, "I notice you. That's enough for now." Minutes passed with no words. I imagined her in her apartment, perhaps curled up on the sofa, phone in hand, hesitating, heart a little heavier than usual. Then she answered, "You always sound so calm. I don't know how you do it." I didn't explain. "Calmness isn't something you explain, it's something you embody." I typed. "I just try to be present." She didn't respond for a while, and I let the silence linger. There was a softness in waiting, an acknowledgement that some things are meant to grow without force. When her next message appeared, it was just one line, "Thanks for being here." I could imagine her leaning back, a faint smile crossing her face, that guarded tension in her shoulders relaxing slightly. I didn't reply immediately, knowing that sometimes the quiet presence of words already sent is enough. We didn't speak again that night, yet the connection settled in the spaces between messages. There was an unspoken understanding that she could reach out when she needed, and I would respond with the same measured steadiness I had offered before. No urgency, no expectations, just the assurance of presence. By the time I put my phone down, the city outside my window had grown quiet. The hum of distant traffic and the soft flicker of streetlights filled the room. Yet in the stillness, I felt the invisible thread between us stretch slightly, patiently, taut, but unstrained. Something had begun, fragile yet undeniable, and the night held it carefully, as if protecting a secret that neither of us needed to define just yet. It started as a drizzle, the kind that makes the city lights shimmer against the wet pavement. I was leaving the office when I saw her stepping out, coat zipped up, hood barely covering her hair. She didn't have an umbrella. I pulled mine from the stand and walked over. "You don't have to," she said, a flicker of hesitation in her voice. "I thought you might need it," I said simply, holding it over her as she stepped closer. Her hand brushed mine briefly, a light contact that felt deliberate and fleeting. She looked at me, half surprised, half relieved, and then moved beneath the canopy. We walked side by side, silence weaving comfortably around us. She didn't ask questions, and I didn't offer explanations. The rain drummed softly above, punctuating our unhurried steps. At the corner of the street, she glanced at me, her eyes searching for something I didn't name. I met her gaze steadily, letting her find what she needed in my quiet presence. "You always do things like this," she said finally, a hint of wonder in her tone. "Do things like what?" I asked, knowing she wasn't looking for a direct answer. "This, noticing, showing up, not asking for it," she said, her words trailing as we crossed the street. I nodded slightly, not correcting her, letting the acknowledgement settle in the space between us. She laughed softly, almost without realizing it, and it carried through the rain. It was brief, delicate, and then the sound was gone, leaving only the rhythm of our footsteps. The umbrella swayed slightly as we walked, the handle occasionally brushing against her arm. I didn't adjust it. The closeness was quiet, measured, unforced. At the station, we paused. The wind picked up, sending droplets across the sidewalk. I held the umbrella a little higher, ensuring she stayed dry. She hesitated before stepping onto the platform, then turned to me. "Thanks," she said, more sincerely this time. "Anytime," I replied. When the train arrived, we stepped aboard, and she stood near the door while I found a spot across the aisle. From there, I could see her profile, the faint tension in her shoulders easing as she leaned slightly, taking in the motion of the city through the window. I didn't intrude, didn't speak. Presence, I realized, could sometimes matter more than conversation. By the time her stop arrived, the rain had eased. She stepped off, glancing back briefly before disappearing into the evening. I stayed on the train, watching the streets slick with reflection, thinking about how small gestures could speak louder than words, and how a simple umbrella could create an invisible bridge between two people who hadn't yet learned how to define themselves to each other. It was a quiet Sunday when she called. I didn't expect her to, not on a day most people reserve for themselves, but there was something in her voice that made me pause and listen carefully. I don't know what to do," she said, voice trembling just enough to betray her usual control. I could hear faint background noise, maybe the hum of her apartment or the street outside, but the details didn't matter. I simply said, "Tell me what's happening." She exhaled sharply, a mixture of frustration and exhaustion. Everything feels too much, like I can't keep up, like I'm failing at things that matter. There was no dramatization in her words, only raw honesty. I didn't try to fix it. I didn't offer platitudes. I stayed silent long enough for her to continue. She spoke about her week, the deadlines she hadn't met, the arguments that had gone unresolved, the weight of family expectations pressing down on her. She admitted she'd been crying alone in her apartment, though she tried to convince herself it wasn't that bad. I listened. No interruptions, no judgments. I let her unload the heaviness, providing a calm counterweight she hadn't realized she needed. After a long pause, she whispered, "I feel like I shouldn't bother anyone with this." "You're not bothering me," I said simply. "You never have." A quiet settled over the line. I didn't speak further, allowing her to breathe into the space we shared, even if it was only through words over the phone. Eventually, she said, "I wish someone would just sit here with me." I said. There was no hesitance, no expectation beyond what she asked. She hesitated for a moment, and then the sound of her lock clicking told me she had opened the door. I arrived, umbrella dripping, coat damp from the lingering drizzle. She was waiting in the living room, shoulders hunched, hands clasped tightly. I didn't move too close, didn't offer advice. I simply sat beside her, a steady presence in the quiet room. She leaned slightly toward me, letting out a long breath she hadn't realized she was holding. We sat in silence for what felt like hours, the air between us heavy but safe, a tangible comfort that didn't require words. When she finally spoke again, it was quieter, steadier. "Thanks for being here." I nodded, knowing that sometimes the act of presence, the simple decision to stay, was more important than anything else. The rain had stopped, leaving streets that gleamed like dark glass. I was parked outside her apartment, engine running softly, waiting. She slid into the passenger seat, her expression guarded, and I didn't rush to speak. The silence wasn't empty, it was deliberate, a space for her to decide how much she wanted to share. "I had a bad day," she said finally, eyes fixed on the raindrops clinging to the window. I nodded, not pressing, just letting her set the pace. "It's okay to tell me," I said gently. "Whatever it." Her hands twisted in her lap. I was thinking about him," voice low, "about someone I trusted, and it's hard not to feel small after." She paused, taking a shaky breath. I didn't interrupt. I let the weight of her words settle between us. "I understand," I said simply. "You're not small. That's what matters here." She looked at me, eyes searching, almost disbelieving. "You always know what to say," she whispered. I shook my head slightly. "I don't. I just listen, and I stay. That's all I can promise." For a moment, the world outside the car ceased to exist. The city lights reflected in her eyes, catching fleeting shadows, and I realized how fragile yet strong she was, holding herself together in pieces. She exhaled slowly, leaning back, as if letting the car absorb some of her tension. "I never thought someone would just wait," she said, almost to herself, "without needing anything in return." "You don't owe me any," I said quietly. "Being here is my choice. I choose it every time." Her gaze softened. For the first time, I saw her walls relax. Not completely, but enough for me to sense the beginnings of trust. The car smelled faintly of rain and upholstery, a quiet cocoon against the city outside. She stayed longer than usual that night, talking about small, inconsequential things, a book she'd been, a song stuck in her head. Slowly, she drifted toward heavier confession, fears, insecurities, moments of doubt, but always in a way that felt safe. I didn't judge, didn't lecture. I just offered presence, a calm anchor she could cling to without needing to articulate gratitude. By the time she left the car, night had deepened, the streets empty and still. She glanced back once, a soft, uncertain smile in her, and I knew that our conversation, our quiet hours together, had shifted something. There was no declaration, no rush, just the subtle affirmation that she could trust me, and I would choose to remain. The week had gone by in its usual rhythm, but I noticed subtle shifts in Brooke. She walked past me in the office, a faint hesitation in her step, a glance that lingered just long enough for me to see recognition in her eyes. It wasn't dramatic, and there were no words spoken, but the change was unmistakable. She declined an invitation from someone she had known longer than she had known me. I noticed only because of the way she moved past my desk afterward, shoulders a little straighter, a small, almost imperceptible smile playing at her lips. She didn't say why, and I didn't ask. Some choices reveal themselves without explanation. Later, during a quiet afternoon, I found her at the window, looking out over the city. The sunlight caught her hair, turning it a warm shade I hadn't noticed before. I didn't approach immediately. Instead, I watched her in that suspended moment, aware that my presence was enough without needing acknowledgement. She turned slightly and caught my gaze, holding it just long enough to communicate something unspoken. Trust, curiosity, something soft and deliberate. We ended up sharing lunch the conversation was light at first, trivial office gossip, a story about a cat she had seen in the park. But gradually, it drifted toward more personal territory. She asked about my routines, my family, my childhood habits. I answered plainly, without embellishment, giving her a window into my life while leaving space for her to retreat if she needed. She listened intently, nodding, occasionally offering a quiet comment that suggested she felt seen. In the afternoon, we walked through the small park behind the office. The air carried the first hint of autumn, leaves brushing against the sidewalk in gentle waves. She slowed to match my pace, and for the first time, I noticed how naturally our steps aligned. The silence between us was comfortable, filled with observation rather than expectation. By the time we returned, the office was empty, yet neither of us rushed. Brooke lingered near the elevator, hands clasped in front of her. She looked at me, her eyes soft, steady. I nodded slightly. No words were necessary. In that simple exchange, the weight of previous hesitations had lifted. She had chosen quietly, deliberately, and I had noticed. That evening, walking back to my apartment, I felt a calm certainty that hadn't been there before. It wasn't an announcement or a declaration. It was something subtler. Presence had spoken louder than words, and in that quiet affirmation, I realized that our connection had shifted. Something patient, deliberate, and deeply rooted had begun to grow. The apartment was quiet the kind of quiet that feels both comforting and deliberate. Brooke opened the door before I could knock, a faint hesitancy in her eyes. I nodded, acknowledging her without words, and stepped inside. She led me to the living room, small and softly lit by a single lamp. The sofa was covered with a well-worn blanket, and she motioned toward it with a tentative gesture. "You don't need to go just yet," she said softly. Her voice carried no demand, only a subtle invitation that made me aware of the trust she placed in that simple I sat beside her, leaving a comfortable space between us. She handed me a cup of tea, and we sipped slowly, the silence punctuated only by the quiet hum of the city. It wasn't empty silence. It was filled with small acknowledgments, glances, faint smiles, the way our hands brushed occasionally against the blanket without tension. "I never expected this connection," she admitted, voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't think someone could just be here." I didn't answer immediately. Words felt unnecessary. Instead, I reached out and adjusted the blanket over her shoulders, a subtle gesture of care without intrusion. She leaned back slightly, a small sigh escaping her, a sign of relief that didn't need elaboration. We watched a film neither of us were fully following. Every so often, she would glance at me, and I would meet her eyes without speaking, letting the quiet communication convey more than conversation ever could. The evening stretched around us, slow and unhurried, marked only by shared presence. At one point, she rested her head lightly against my shoulder. I didn't move, didn't react beyond steadying her subtly with my arm. She didn't fall asleep, didn't demand anything. She simply allowed herself to be supported, and I allowed myself to stay. When the credits rolled, the room had grown darker, the outside world reduced to distant streetlights and occasional passing cars. Brooke didn't speak of leaving, and I didn't suggest it. There was no need. In that shared quiet, an unspoken understanding had settled between us. She could stay, and I would. Eventually, she shifted slightly, eyes meeting mine. A faint, genuine smile appeared, one that held acknowledgement, trust, and a tentative promise of continuity. I returned it with the same steady calm, knowing that nothing needed to be defined tonight. The connection had taken root, quietly but irreversibly, and the simple act of staying, of being present, was enough to mark the beginning of something lasting.